Thank you. Welcome and good morning. At the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos, my name is Felicia Orth. I'm a worship associate for this congregation. Our minister, the Reverend John Cullinan, is out of the pulpit this Sunday, but we are delighted to welcome one of our congregants as our guest speaker, Stephen Ledoux. There he is. As Unitarian Universalists, we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person and the interconnection of us all. Whoever you are, whomever you love, you are welcome here. Please join us following the service in Fellowship Hall for coffee and conversation. Turn then to the worship, the chalice lighting, which comes from the minister I had as a teenager in Geneva, Illinois. To face the world's shadows, a chalice of light. To face the world's coldness, a chalice of warmth. To face the world's terrors, a chalice of courage. To face the world's turmoil, a chalice of peace. May its glow fill our spirits, our hearts, and our lives. No. All right. Hymn number 298, if you would stand as you're able for hymn 298. And by the way, we have definitely made the slides more readable now, but if you would still prefer to sing from a hymnal, the hymnals are available just outside this door. Again, please stand for hymn 298. If you would remain standing, please, for our affirmation. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve life and fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony. Thus do we covenant with each and with all. Thank you. Please be seated. Candles of community. A candle has been lit this morning for a friend named Carl who entered hospice recently. Please, I know you have joys and concerns that are left unspoken. Please, let's join in a moment of silence as we reflect on those joys and sorrows. The prayer comes from Leif Seligman. We pause in the stillness to rest for a moment, to quiet ourselves so that we can feel what stirs within us. Each breath draws us closer to the pulse of life, and with each exhalation we make room for something new. May we find in this gathering the comfort of those who care. Meditation Hymn 83. Reverend Tina DeYoe will share Time for All Ages.
So if you're young or young at heart and want to come up and see this story that we're going to talk about today, come on up to this worshiper's rug. So if you want to come up, please feel free. Hey, hey, hey. Okay, so this is a story about Noah and the flood, or Noah and the Rainbow Covenant. Maybe some of you have heard it. It is one of the myths around this big flood that happened like 7,000 years ago, like way far away from us. But there was this huge flood, and there's lots of stories about this flood, and Stephen's going to be talking to us today about that. But I'm going to tell us one of the stories that came from when this flood happened. So maybe you heard of it. And it comes from Hebrew scripture or the Bible. So maybe some of you have read this story there. And it goes something like this. Did you ever make such a mess of your homework that you just got crazy mad and frustrated and wanted to crumple it all up and throw it away? Anyone? Anyone? Yeah? Maybe? Yeah? Yeah. So that's what this God person in this story, right? So there was this God in this story, And this God was feeling like that, like he just wanted to crumple up the world and throw it away, right? So he was looking around, and this God said, "You pour your heart and soul into making this wonderful world full of people and animals and plants, and if you think it's easy, try getting the stripes on a zebra just right." All that effort, and for what? A year or two went by, or 1,500 years, and the whole thing is a mess. So this God made the world, right? People, what was I thinking? And this God thought the people were rotten. Oh no. They lie, they cheat, they murder, they steal. There's not a decent one in the whole bunch. Darn it, I should just start over. So it's kind of like starting over with your homework, right? So I should just... What if your teacher doesn't have an extra homework, right? Yeah, that's a good question. So, you don't have homework. So, we're going to just get rid of this whole mess and start from scratch. That's what this God was thinking, okay, in the story. So, yep, that's what I think I'll do. So, this God took a good look around to make sure that there were not, in fact, any decent people to be destroyed. And it turned out this God found one good, kind, living person called Noah. And this is Noah and his wife. There we go. And this family of Noah's was there, and God said to Noah, "This world is just plain no good, and I'm planning on getting rid of all the people except you and your family. So this is what you have to do. You have to build a really big boat, okay? And big enough for not only you and your family, but also a pair of every kind of animal there is. I'll give you some time, but you better get on it because I'm going to rain this whole place out. And anyone who isn't on that boat is going to drown." Yes. You know the story, Noah's Ark? Yeah, you know the story. Okay. Yeah, so that's what we're... Fish or whales, yeah. They don't need it. Yeah, so maybe the fish and whales can survive in the flood. Tiny, teeny, eensy fish can go on there? Yeah, maybe, yeah. So, 'cause what? They wouldn't take up much room. Yeah, this is true. Is what? Yeah, elephants. Yeah, because they can swim too, so. I know, it's a big boat. So we got a bunch of animals. Do what? You can give them a snorkel. Yup. So we got birds in here. We got rhinoceroses in here, right? So they're gathering up all of the animals 2 by 2. We got chickens, yep, and roosters. And we got elephants, like you said, the big elephants. They even went on there, right, in this story that we're telling. We got horses. We got lions. Yeah. Zebra. Yeah. Yep. We got sheep. And we got, yeah, whatever this one is. I'm not really sure. Some other animal here. Yeah. So they gathered up the animals 2 by 2, right, to get on the boat. What? Oh, sorry. There we go. And all of the people in Noah's family. So they built a boat, and they put the animals on it, and Noah, probably when God said this to Noah, he was having a hard time believing what was going to happen. So he gathered his family, he told them, and they probably didn't believe him either, right? So again, they got the animals together, and they built this ginormous boat. And guess what happened after they built it? The flood, the rains came, right? Oh no. But it didn't knock the boat down, or the people. So the rains came, and then And then we have the flood, and they're sailing, they're on their boat, they're safe, right? So the rains came. The people ran to the windows of the ark and were astonished to see blue sky. This was 40 days of rain, right? So then, after 40 days, the rain stopped, and they saw this blue sky, but there was still water everywhere, right? So they ran to the windows, and then they sent out a raven, right, to fly around and look for land. But it came back tired, for there was nowhere to rest. So Noah waited another week, and then he sent out a dove. Woo, woo. I don't know. That's just how it is in this story. So then he sent out the dove. The dove came back, and it didn't find any land either. So Noah waited another week to send out the dove again, and then the dove came back with an olive branch. It found some land. Pretty cool, huh? So they were finally able to see that the waters were going to recede, and the waters started to recede, and the boat was landed on top of this hill. Yeah, kind of got stuck, right? But then the people could leave, and they could go out on the land again. And then what God came back and said to Noah and Noah's family, God said, "Welcome home. So I will make a deal with you, a promise, a covenant. My covenant is with all the beings on the earth, not just the people. So you should go forth and populate the earth and fill it again with love and all of your kind. And I promise never to flood the earth again. And as a sign of my covenant, I will put a rainbow in the clouds. So every time you see a rainbow, it will remind you of the covenant to create and preserve life." So that is one story that came from the Bible and Hebrew scriptures about this crazy flood that happened 7,000 years ago, right? So that's a story that you might hear more of today, okay? We still see rainbows today. 7,000 years old? Yeah, exactly. So, and remember, this is kind of a story, so, So, yeah. So if you have questions about the story, you can talk to me afterwards, and we will talk about it more. Does that sound good? And for now, you can go back to the intention table. So thanks for listening to this fun Noah flood story. And for all your questions. You have really good questions. It's very true.
This is a reading from the book on Noah's flood. Elsewhere, the first warning of the coming disaster was the whisper of a sound, a weak throbbing from far away. Several bands of farmers on the delta had settled in clusters of post and beam houses surrounded by fields and corrals. They grew grain, raised cattle, fished in the nearby lake, and hunted game in the marsh. Confused by the strange sound, they stood on the bluff and stared in the direction from which it seemed to radiate. They could see nothing except a constant cloud that lit up the night sky. A group of distant kinsmen, haggard and terrified, came in along the shore. They described how their valley had been inundated. The waters of the great salt sea above were pouring into the lake below. The hollow where they had lived had become a wild flume. Their villages had been swept away by the torrent. Days later, the rising water encroached on the delta and invaded some of the nearest fields nearest the lake through the network of irrigation ditches. The puddles swirled around their dwellings and soon imperiled the granaries. The far-off noise thundered louder and louder, while the water mounted every day, bringing with it a wash of floating debris. The frightened villagers headed upriver into the hills. Apprehensive that they were being punished, they made sacrifices to their goddess, praying that this awful nightmare would soon pass. If the waters did not recede, the people pledged to retreat across the mountain divide in search of new land. Most likely, we are all familiar with Bible stories, like Noah building a big boat and stuffing it with 2 of every kind of living thing to escape the flood caused by a supposed global deluge. We were all raised on this story and likely inspired by it. We may even be better persons due to some of the lessons in it. Stories on many topics in most cultures were all humanity had for many millennia. Today, however, we also have science. Can science, however, provide similar stories with similar outcomes, similar effects, make us better persons, inspire us? My bias suggests a yes answer. Perhaps a closer look at the flood story, as told by science discoveries, will be revealing. Noah's story, of course, is not the only great flood story. Many ancient cultures have supplied history with similar flood stories. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh. These stories seem to have originated around the same time, from cultures that share a large but limited geographic range, a few thousand miles across, centered on Anatolia, more recently known as Turkey. So, what happened? Did holy scribes in several cultures all get told by their local god at about the same time to write down a lesson-filled flood story? Or did something really happen, something of such seriousness that it prompted continuous retelling, at first orally, and then possibly a millennium or more later in written forms? Historians know that our oral traditions can last even longer than this, with compelling accuracy. The written versions usually contain some added layers of lessons. But what could have happened? What natural, though catastrophic, events could predictably have had that kind of effect on people, prompting such continuous retelling in the terms of the times about a god or gods punishing the taboo activities of some peoples in those cultures by wiping out the world in a great deluge and flood? Now, maybe Noah's story occurred just as his story tells it. Or maybe it is but one mystical story among many with moral lessons. Yet in 1999, a science magazine's author's brief book review in a letter caught my eye. It discussed a book titled Noah's Flood, the new discoveries about the events that changed history. In this book, the authors, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, reported their multidisciplinary research results as leaving little doubt that something really did happen, and that this science flood story helps many otherwise unrelated puzzle pieces fit together into a meaningful whole. For years, however, other ongoing life events, such as writing other books, kept me distracted from this fascinating topic. And there matters stood until a letter and response in the July-August issue, 2023 issue, of another periodical, Skeptical Inquirer, inspired renewed interest. The discussants in that issue seemed quite unaware of the discoveries reported 20 years earlier in Ryan and Pittman's book. Why? Were there substantive, science-grounded concerns, objections, criticisms of their work? My subsequent search failed to turn up any that seemed decisively compelling. Your search may vary. But my search did, of course, turn up lots of unhelpful, though predictable, pushback from people compelled to prefer a literal Bible reading. So, what's all the fuss about? Our Western cultural traditions, among others, have appreciated several versions of the Great Flood story for millennia. And in the last couple hundred years, the increasing appreciation of science and its improved methods for collecting hard data has also increased interest in what such data might tell us about stories like the Great Flood. Can data satisfy our curiosity? Can data answer our questions about what really happened, to whom, where, when, and why? Indeed, the mere possibility of some solid scientific answers about this well-known story is itself somewhat inspiring, although perhaps not in the traditional ways. We cannot here cover everything that Ryan and Pittman and their hundreds of colleagues discovered. For that, do read the book. But we can cover a few of their main points, and through them, perhaps paint a picture of what science has begun to tell us about the Great Flood, what really happened, to whom, where, when, and why. Now, originally, the relevant data began to accumulate from diverse times and places and people. It gradually piled up, like loose puzzle pieces in a box. But only late in the process did anyone begin to see connections of those puzzle pieces with the Great Flood story. By a dozen points, here are some puzzle pieces that piled up. Point: the discovery of unknown ancient writings in different languages and their initial translations showed some close interrelations among them. These interrelations suggested that some kind of language diaspora had occurred. Point: geology had already shown that big floods do happen. For example, 5 million years ago, before any humans were around, the Mediterranean basin had been empty for some time. And then the Gibraltar barrier broke, unleashing a flood that would make Noah's great flood seem wimpy. Point: today, the Black Sea, the salty Black Sea, in its over 6,000-foot deep basin, is level with the Mediterranean Sea. From before 8,000 BCE, however, and for at least a couple thousand years, the basin contained a slowly drying out and shrinking freshwater lake. By about 6,000 BCE, the lake had a level some 550 feet lower than today's Mediterranean Sea, because at this time, the Bosporus was not open to the basin. Point: sonar data show the now submerged ancient Stone Age deltas of some of the rivers that flow into the Black Sea basin. Back then, they flowed into the lower, smaller freshwater lake. Indeed, sonar data indicate the lowest shoreline of the ancient shrunken lake to be about 550 feet below the level of today's Black Sea, revealing hundreds of miles of gently sloping land surface that now remain underwater. Point. Fossils in the core samples from the Black Sea show that the transition from fresh water to salty water happened quickly on human timescales. Some cores also showed the presence of dry mud flats just above those fossils, just under those fossils. And other cores showed sand dunes that had not been altered by any gradual rise in the level of the nearby lake, but had instead been quickly inundated. Point. Dating of the core parts from the time just before the saltwater invasion gives an age of some 7,600 years ago, which is about 5,600 BCE. Around this time, the pressure of water, which had been building in the Mediterranean Sea as its level rose hundreds of feet due to end of Ice Age melting, it broke through the Bosphorus land dam and began dumping Mediterranean Sea saltwater into the somewhat empty Black Sea basin and its ancient freshwater lake. Point. By the time of this saltwater invasion, farming had already been practiced in neighboring Anatolia and Greece for over 1,000 years. Sadly, present science budgets cannot afford searches under the waters of the Black Sea basin for archaeological evidence of farming. Point. Still, the presence of farming around the freshwater lake shoreline makes an appropriate presumption. The farming communities around the ancient lake would have had substantive investments in their homeland. Expulsion by a permanent flood would have been close to annihilation. Point. From the input of the rivers into the basin, if the water in the lake had risen gradually at the rate that the oceans rose once glacial ice caps started melting, the fastest rate would never have exceeded 6 feet a century, which is about 1/500th of an inch per day. You're welcome to check my math. The dating, however, of the evidence from numerous core samples and from the discovered size and height of the later Bosphorus opening shows that the lake level rose at a much faster rate. It rose at the rate of 6 inches per day. Given the shallow slope of the basin's sides, a 6-inch rise in water level each day would each day cover another mile of dry land with water. Point. The usual response of hunters and gatherers to floods is simply to move on. Such floods and movements were common enough and no big deal in the hunter-gatherer experience. An exodus, however, would have had the power to build myth, as farmers and herders would have had to take their seed and animals with them for survival. Point. The sonar data showed that on the wide shelf of the ancient lake, west of the Crimea, the dry land around the lake angled up at no more than 2 feet per mile. Someone escaping the onslaught of the rising tide on this shelf would have had to travel, on the average, 1/4 mile per day to keep up with the inundation. Point. If fleeing up the very flat river valleys, they would have had to move 1/2 mile to 1 mile per day, every day, day after day, for more than the traditional 40 days, more likely for 100 to 200 days to cover enough ground to stay out of the rising water. And all these days, they would have needed to worry about and carry all that they could carry. Certainly, this was a unique and scary months-long trek that would not soon be forgotten. And so began the multi-direction migration of peoples and practices away from the rising sea and into the facts and legends of history. Indeed, the oral traditions of many cultures in this widening geographic area retold this story with many different culture-derived and culture-supporting embellishments, such as king lists and religious morals and biases. These embellished stories come down to us today from when the oral traditions were finally written in stone, literally in clay tablets, and later on in papyrus and vellum and paper, as the stories of the likes of Gilgamesh and Noah. After assembling the data that led to a location, a date, a calculation of the magnitude of the flood, the time available to escape, and the distances to be covered in escaping, many questions still remained. Who might have witnessed the flood and formed the subsequent migration? What languages did they speak? Where did they go and settle? Numerous strands of evidence document that around this time, in the wake of the Black Sea flood, several peoples appeared as if out of nowhere in the archaeological record, to the west and northwest of the Black Sea basin, as well as to its northeast and southeast. These were farming peoples, settling on unoccupied lands or on previously occupied lands, as well as on land occupied by hunter-gatherers whom they displaced. All but one of these groups strictly avoided living near ocean coastlines, as if they had been chased upstream by a flood and still worried that the fountains of the deep would spring forth again. The areas where the new peoples from the flooded diaspora quickly appeared include not only parts of Europe and southern Russia, but also Anatolia, Mesopotamia, the Levant, Egypt, and indeed the whole Fertile Crescent. So the cradle from which Western civilization actually sprang seems really to have been the flooded rim of the Black Sea Basin's old freshwater lake. The data even strongly suggest that the flood-caused diaspora not only began the foundational branching of the daughter languages of Proto-Indo-European, but also similarly timed a branching of the human genetic tree. This real and horrifying flood experience thus remained alive in the continual and increasingly multilingual retelling from across numerous cultures, from Europe to India, from Russia to Africa, and into today's world. In our own time, beyond the well-researched preservative techniques of epic storytelling, natural science has added analyses of the preservative documentation in the kinds of texts recorded in the layers of mud, sand, and gravel from the bottom of lakes and seas, using the tools and principles of physics, chemistry, biology. The scientific plot can then be given richer details and new themes from the supporting contributions of the archaeologist, the linguist, and the geneticist. The discoveries that produced all these points were originally, as I've mentioned at the beginning, unrelated, occurring a piece here, a bit there. Any interconnections initially went unrecognized. Little by little, however, the researchers began to connect the dots. Patterns and sequences of facts and dates began to stand out. The big picture began to emerge. So far, though, like those discoveries, my presentation of all those points necessarily comes out a bit disjointed. But now we can put them together and paint that big picture as a new flood story, a science flood story for today's world. Today, the top 50 feet of the Bosphorus flows south out of the Black Sea. Meanwhile, the rest of the Bosphorus waters, the salty bottom currents below 50 feet, flows north into the Black Sea, a last vestige of the Great Flood that happened in 5600 BCE, or 7,624 years ago. Below the river sediments, the channel of the Bosphorus, cut by the flood's inflow, bottoms out at 400 feet deep, about 100 feet above the level of the shrunken Ice Age Black Sea Lake. Initially, the floodwater through the gap may have started out just as a trickle, a small stream. Within days, however, it would have washed through the loose gravels and soils, gaining power first as a brook and then as an ever-growing river, swiftly and forcefully scouring and gouging out its bottom and sides, deeper and wider. Within days, it became a turbulent river with the torrent of a maelstrom. Within days, it became a thundering flume, twisting and churning with rubble and debris, cutting deeper and spreading faster as it poured out 10 cubic miles of water every day, enough to cover Manhattan Island each day to a depth of over half a mile. For around 2 years, mostly after the human population had fled, the floodwaters continued to climb up the shallow sides of the Black Sea basin, perhaps with less violence in the second year. The waters finally filled the basin to the present Black Sea level, the level of the Bosphorus and the Mediterranean, over 500 feet above the level of the ancient Ice Age lake. When the swollen Mediterranean waters had fully broken through the Bosphorus land dam and flooded in, the flood flowed in with the volume of 200 Niagaras, quickly raising the lake level by those 6 inches per day, covering another mile-wide swath of previous dry land all around the rising shoreline. The Bosphorus flume roared and surged at full spate for at least 300 days. The waters roared through the narrow Bosphorus Strait at speeds greater than 50 miles per hour, crashing through unabated, radiating a thunderous din and vibration that could possibly be heard and felt fully around the entire rim of the Black Sea, a shoreline that hosted and supported numerous communities, people that must now get out of the way. The beginning of that din was the last of various warning signs, but one still had time to flee. And would the low-pitched rumbling terror sound like the warning voice of a powerful deity, supposedly ticked off by some human iniquities, telling of a permanent flood and it's time to move away? And move away people did, moving daily to higher and higher ground, mile after terrible, tortured mile, and to escape from what? Such incredible, continuous violence may only have been understandable to the people in that time as nothing short of the collective fury of all their gods, whom they must have somehow displeased. With all this water and flooding, who needs fire and brimstone? All those experiences got indelibly planted in the survivors' oral and later written history. And for those whose migration led them to Mesopotamia, where some of the great flood stories continued, their oral histories were regularly dramatized and reinforced by the usual floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, reminding them of the big one from which they got away. That was how they told their story to all their descendant generations and cultures, each with its particular slant and variation of the flood escape theme, retold in and beyond the original diaspora, retold for us as the Noah story, retold until today, with a new story version emerging from the human activity known as science, and with new and appropriate lessons for human behavior and how we treat each other and our world and everything in it. So now we have a different kind of story about the same ancient flood. Beyond the incontestable emotional reactions that we have to such horrendous legendary events, both then and now, Today we have some incontestable scientific facts about the actual historical events behind the many flood stories, and with at least as many lessons to help us move through today's world and on into tomorrow's world. That ancient flood forced a diaspora of peoples and cultures. Their movements and their stories have left us, and the stories they left us have, over the past 7 millennia, indeed changed the course of human history. And today, the scientific story about the flood can and must similarly change the course of today's history on into the future. Please, let that inspire you.
Our offering is an opportunity to share some of what we have with the wider world. Our Share the Plate partner for this month is Los Alamos Family Council. All offering funds for the month of March are accepted on behalf of Los Alamos Family Council, a local nonprofit that promotes emotional and social well-being through education, prevention, and counseling. The Family Council runs at least 2 programs: the Counseling Center, to provide counseling for adults, adolescents, and children, and 2 youth activity centers, one in Los Alamos and one in White Rock, to provide a safe environment and develop resiliency in youth, grades 3 through 8, after school and when school is on vacation. You may place cash or check in one of the baskets as it passes. Use the giving box at the back of the sanctuary or the Givelify app on your mobile device. Thank you for your generosity. May what you give bring you joy and a sense of greater connection to our wider world. Thank you, Nelly. Before we conclude the service, I should change the slides. I'd like to remind you that announcements and information about upcoming events can be found in a lot of places. First of all, I would encourage you to peruse the bottom of the back of the order of service that I hope you picked up on your way into the sanctuary. We also have lots of announcements, upcoming events on our website, in this month's issue of The Voice, which is our monthly newsletter, on our Facebook page, in our weekly emails. I've called out, I could have done literally 3 slides today, and I just picked out a few things happening this week. Next Saturday is a really big day. We have the Ground Spring cleanup from 9 to 4. You would see Janet Van Cleve if you want more information about that. And then at 5, after you've run home and showered, now you've worked up a real appetite, we have an all-church dinner to kick off our pledge campaign. That's at 5, and we have a really fun St. Patrick's Day menu. Game night is March 15th. We have climate solutions forums in 2 parts. The first part's on March 10th. The second part's on March 17th. Photo directory update. Our photo directory is out of date. You might even get a chuckle looking at your old photo. I did. So if you'd like to submit a photo to the office administrator, you can do that, or you can have your photo taken in Fellowship Hall. Let's see, Rebecca Howard, I think, was helping to do that. There's also a social justice book discussion. If you want to be part of that, Evan Rose is doing that, and Kelly Shea. And the annual collection drive for Espanola Pathways Shelter has been continuing since February 17th. It continues through March 17th. We're still actively collecting for the drive. Tyler Taylor there is who you would contact if you want additional information about requested items. Tina, anything else to add?
The book discussion will be on March 18th.
March 18th, thank you for that.
We'll have the author present for like a Q&A discussion.
Great, thank you so much.
Last week at the forum.
Yes, yes. All right. Once again, if you would stand as you're able for hymn 118, This Little Light of Mine. Thank you.